Hi there, welcome to the week 13 help video. I wanted to talk this week about reflexive verbs, reflexive pronouns, and we're going to talk a little bit about them as vocabulary and as grammar. So looking through my Spanish lab assignments for this week, there was one particular one that had to do with reflexives that seemed to be the most problematic. So I wanted to just go quickly through it. There are a lot of resources in Blackboard, but I wanted to make sure that you have plenty of support in understanding what reflexive verbs are and how they work. So these are the verbs that we use a lot of times to talk about our daily routines. Things like getting up, getting dressed, putting makeup on, fixing our hair, taking a shower, all those kinds of things. In Spanish, we use reflexive verbs. What did I say? In English or in Spanish? In Spanish, we use reflexive verbs. In English, we sometimes use reflexive verbs, but not very often, and there's usually another verb that we prefer to use. So like, for example, I could say in English, I bathe myself, but usually instead I'll say I take a bath. In Spanish, though, we'll use the reflexive verb bañarse to talk about that. So for a lot of those daily routines, we're going to use reflexive verbs because they're things that we do to ourselves, and that's the meaning of that reflexive pronoun, is that the person doing the action is doing it to themselves. They are both the actor and the recipient of the action. So that's kind of the underlying meaning of those reflexives, that reflexive construction. So as I said, we're learning this as vocabulary and as grammar. So this week, a good portion of the vocabulary that you're learning are those reflexive verbs, and you're learning them as a verb with that se attached to the end. And that se just indicates that it's a reflexive pronoun. So for example, when you learn bañarse, and you learn it as bañarse, you're learning that that word means to bathe oneself. Okay, or levantarse means to get up, or to get oneself up out of bed. So that's how you're learning them. Memorize them as reflexives, and then the next step is to learn how to use those in a sentence. Now, sometimes the simple way to use them is when we want to just use the infinitive, the unconjugated form of the verb. Like if I were talking about my day tomorrow, I could say, mañana voy a levantarme a las 6. Right? Tomorrow I'm going to wake up at 6. Now that's easy. I didn't have to conjugate it. The only thing I had to do was say levantarme instead of levantarse, because I'm talking about getting myself up. So there, we can use that, and then we don't have to conjugate it. But if I'm talking about my general daily routines and I do need to conjugate the verb, then I need to do two things. One, I have to change the reflexive pronoun to accurately reflect the subject of the sentence. And then I also have to conjugate the verb to agree with the subject of the sentence. So I'm doing a two-step process here. Okay, so let's look at an example of how we would do this on a conjugation chart. Let's say we're going to go ahead and use levantarme, levantarse. Sorry, the reflexive is levantarse. And that, of course, means to get oneself up. And the reason that I'm putting oneself in parentheses is because it's kind of a confusing way to think about it for us as English speakers, but since the se does mean oneself, it helps to put that in there in the definition. Okay, so if I'm going to talk about getting myself up, the first step is I take that reflexive pronoun, that se is the reflexive pronoun, and the first step of conjugating it is to put that in the beginning and make it reflect the subject. So the reflexive, the pronoun that reflects yo is me. Okay, and then I'm going to conjugate levantar. If I look at levantar, it's a regular AR verb, so I'm just going to conjugate it as a regular AR verb. Levanto. Okay, so yo me levanto. Then the conjugation for tú. Sorry. The conjugation for tú, the reflexive pronoun becomes te and moves to the beginning before the conjugated verb. And then I'm going to conjugate for a regular AR verb, levantas, tú te levantas. For él, ella, and usted, the reflexive pronoun stays se, but I do still have to move it to the beginning of the verb, put it before the conjugated form. And the conjugation for a regular AR verb is levanta. Okay, nosotros, the reflexive is nos. And then I'm going to conjugate the verb as levantamos. Vosotros, which of course won't show up in my Spanish lab, but still is good to be aware of. Os levantáis. And then ellos, ellas, and ustedes. Again, it's going to be se, so you'll notice that the pronoun is the same for the singular and plural third person forms. Se levanta. Okay, so that's what we're doing with these reflexives when we conjugate them, is we have to do two parts. We take the reflexive pronoun, move it before the conjugated verb, and make it reflect the subject. Yo, me, tú, te, él, ella, usted, se, nosotros, nos, vosotros, os, and ellos, ellas, ustedes, se. And these pronouns, these reflexive pronouns, are not taking the place of the subject pronoun. There is still a subject in these sentences. So if I wanted to, I could say, yo me levanto a las 6. I don't have to include the yo, but I can still include it. It's not incorrect to include it. Just as a side note there for usage. So anyway, make sure that you're learning these both as vocabulary, learning what they mean, levantarse, bañarse, vestirse, all of that, and then also learning how you conjugate them and how you use them. Okay, the biggest thing to avoid is make sure that you're taking the se off first before you conjugate it, and putting it before the conjugated form of the verb. Okay, if at any point you are using it in the infinitive, like the example I gave earlier, like tomorrow I'm going to get up at this time. Voy a levantarme. Even if I'm not conjugating the verb, I need to make sure that I'm using the correct reflexive pronoun in the sentence that I'm using. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have questions, and I will see you online.